Welcome.
Thank you. So hi, I'm Jonah. I'm on Twitter at Playful Systems. So I'm going to be talking today about the act of drawing in games and kind of describe my journey in exploring its history. And so just to be clear, this is not about creating assets for games, art assets. This is about the actual act of drawing and games that use that as a mechanic. So why drawing games? So as an interactive act, it's simple, it's direct, it's primal. It's something we've been doing for tens of thousands of years. This is made by the Neanderthals 64,000 years ago. It's also inherently playful, something that you think might be a good fit for games. These are all from my 4-year-old daughter. I also have a personal interest in the topic. So growing up, I always loved to draw and paint, and also program. And growing up in the 80s, as you'd expect, these paths never quite connected or crossed. But in school, I started to realize that they could. I was lucky enough to study under Golan Levin, who produced this. I was kind of blown away just by the magic of just taking an algorithm, simply repeating the same gesture over and over again. This is his yellowtail. He also introduced me to the work of Scott Snibbe in Motion Phone. This is like an abstract animation tool made in 1995, where users could draw animation paths for shapes to follow and create kind of abstract compositions. He also showed me Fug Paint by Ben Fry, which is a misbehaving paint program. It's basically every time you run it, each colored brush acts differently from either kind of annoyingly following your brush around after you use it, or making it a scribble, or like erasing the previous one. It's pretty fun to play around with. And I also was interested in making games, so here are a few that I've kind of developed or worked on throughout the years. So the top left is Aidi. It's a game set in Haiti about poverty. Bottom left was a multi-touch physics platformer for mobile called Pangolin. Top right is a word game using a massive natural language data set called Word After Word. And then shown here, over there, is Sloppy Forgeries, a multiplayer painting game. That's kind of the impetus for this research. So I was also inspired by Golan in that he always did like just fantastic research on prior artwork for any project he worked on. So these are kind of two of his studies, researching new media performances using overhead projectors on the left and then slit scan video artworks on the right. They're all on his website, flong.com, which I'd recommend checking out. So before I started kind of looking into it, I thought I should probably have a fancy definition for drawing games. So basically, I'm just saying a game where the player's primary method of interaction is through the act of drawing or mark making, and where the drawing act is essential to its gameplay. So I started making a list, a very long list of places of games and places I found them, drawing games and places I found them. And I started kind of finding them in clumps. So I'd find one, and then I'd realize, okay, there's more within this genre or this place. So children's anthologies and magazines, the late 19th century, a lot of parlor games, also late 19th century, and like homemaking and entertainment guides. Of course, board games, mouse games, Nintendo DS, the first stylus-based game platform, touchscreen games, and more recently, kind of indie art games. And some of these roughly translate to technologies like pencil and paper folk games, board games, arcade games, mouse games, console games, stylus games, and touchscreen games. And I kind of use these icons throughout the presentation so you can kind of get a sense of what platform these games are on. So as I made this list, I kind of realized that there were a lot of interesting moments where games in drawing collided that didn't quite fit my definition. One of which was iRobot, which was made by Atari in 1983 as an arcade cabinet. It was the first game that used 3D filled polygons. And this isn't the game, but they had another mode in the cabinet that allowed you to take the game assets and kind of draw with them in this 3D space. So I think you could put in your quarter and then draw for 3 minutes and then switch back to the game. And I think like each minute you took would subtract a life if you then wanted to go back and play the game. Kind of weird. I also started realizing that even with my definition, like what a drawing game wasn't really cut and dry. Like, you know, the top left we've got Black, a game that uses the same algorithm that I showed that Yellowtail uses, where it repeats a gesture, and that definitely feels like a drawing game. It feels like drawing, but then Fruit Ninja definitely does not feel like drawing. So like, how much of a line has to be interactive for it to be a drawing game, and then how long does it have to be on screen? Also, if the player is like playing with, does interface matter? So if the player is playing with keyboard input, is that okay? Should that be considered a drawing game? Like how much abstraction in the interaction is okay? And like what is digital drawing? And then I found this, which is an engraving made in 1657 depicting children playing something that translates to the game of Fart in the Face, which has nothing to do with drawing games, so I really needed to focus. And so I started making some categories. I came up with 3. So semiotic drawing games are games where players create drawings that represent other things, and the meaning in the game is derived from the concept that it's representing, so games like Pictionary. Line drawing games where drawn lines derive their meaning from the physical properties in their location in space, kind of like Bleck. And art-making games where the primary focus is in the service of creating an artwork or a final artifact. So within semiotic games, it seems to kind of like fall into 2 categories: communication games and symbol recognition games. Should be pretty self-explanatory. And then looking into communication games, I found, I did some research, and the first game I could find was called Original Sketches, found in Cassell's Book of Indoor Amusements in 1881, and is described as a small sketch that is drawn by everyone, representing an historical incident. On the sketches being completed, each player passes the paper to his left-hand neighbor, who writes down at the bottom of the paper what he imagines the drawing is meant to represent. The paper is then folded and passed on to the left, and the various opinions are read out loud. So it's non-competitive, just kind of a fun thing to do on a Saturday night, but it's the first recorded drawing and guessing activity I could find. Some other notable communication games, The Game, which is a kind of a combination of charades and Pictionary, played in early 20th century. Eat Poop, You Cat, which is a telephone-like Pictionary kind of game, the precursor to Telestrations. Pictionary, obviously, Duplic, A Fake Artist Goes to New York, Pictomania, Draw Something, Drawful, and Quick Draw by Google. And of these, I think one of the most interesting, if you haven't played it, is to check out A Fake Artist Goes to New York. So it's a game where players all take turns to draw part of a picture, except one player who's drawing doesn't know what they're drawing. And the goal is to find out who that person is. So when you're playing, there's like a really great tension of like how much information to reveal and what part of the picture to reveal so people know what you're drawing, but not to give it away to the person who doesn't know. It also just results in some really kind of interesting, surreal pictures. The first symbol recognition game I could find was Black and White. It's kind of a famous god game where the player, you can draw gestures to cast spells. It's kind of like a common thing in these types of games. It's not quite essential to the gameplay, but it's the first, so it's worth mentioning. And other ones, Magic Touch and Darklings. So I think of the genres, might be the kind of least interesting. It's mostly just kind of substituting a gesture for an action. Although Darklings might be worth checking out. It also has this kind of like you're drawing to collect these stars, and so the gesture drawing and the collecting stars kind of interact in interesting ways, and it does kind of create a nice flow state for players. So line drawing games, I've got path games, so players create paths to represent movement. Object creation games, where you're drawing kind of objects within the game with physical properties. Space marking games, where you're marking space, usually surrounding areas with lines. And of path drawing games, the first I found was French and English. It was kind of interesting. In 1864, this was a slate game, so kids could play this on the small blackboards that they would bring to class, and players would alternate drawing lines. And so you would draw a quick line from your cannon to the opponent's targets, and you take turns, and then the player who kind of hit all the targets first wins. Other notable path drawing games, Kirby Canvas Curse by Nintendo, 2005. Flight Control for mobile. There's a ton of mobile games like this, like Harbor Master and Draw Race, that use this drawing like as a path mechanic. Bleck, which I mentioned, and Doodle Quest, which is kind of interesting using transparencies. It's kind of a board game. And of these, I'd check out Bleck. Again, it uses that kind of repeating gesture of Yellowtail and just puts it in like a thoughtful game environment with pickups and things to avoid and stuff like that. In terms of object creation games, the first I could find was Line Rider. It was released in 2006 as a Flash game, so you're kind of drawing the ground below a sled to travel over. It was conceived kind of more as a toy, so players could kind of create their own levels and share them with friends and stuff. Other notable object creation games I found were Crayon Physics, Solop Skier, and Max and the Magic Marker. And Max and the Magic Marker is worth checking out. It takes the kind of the premise of Crayon Physics, where you're drawing objects in a simulated environment to solve puzzles, and kind of combines it with a traditional platformer, where you have like kind of a limited amount of ink. The first documented game about space marking I found was called La Pippo Pipette. Also, I think called Boxes and Lines. You've probably played this, described in 1889. So you're starting with an empty grid where players take turns to make lines. You surround a square, and then you mark it as your own. And the player with the most area wins. Other kind of notable space marking games I found, Blockade. It's kind of like a snake-like multiplayer game in 1976. Kicks. An arcade game about kind of marking territory. It's kind of a risk-reward situation. Quantum, Polarium, Pokemon Ranger, and Splix.io. Of these, I think Splix.io is worth a look. It's a really simple game. It's kind of like a massively multiplayer snake-like game where you're trying to capture as much territory as possible. But it's kind of like surprisingly engaging and social, and a lot of personality comes out in the different kinds of gameplay strategies about taking over other people's territories or just kind of getting your own. And then the last I have is the art making games. So these can kind of be divided up into art making rule sets, which aren't aren't strictly games, but are mostly more kind of like activities that define constraints that kind of result in creative artworks. Then we have asset creation games, where your players are actually creating the in-game artwork, like the characters or the pickups or what have you. And then artist simulation games, where the player is playing the role of an artist creating artwork and often kind of trying to make a living. And so for art making rule sets, so there's like a ton of these, so this is not the best, because a lot of these aren't quite games, so I didn't go too deep with this, but I did try to figure out kind of the first of these that I could find was Head, Body, and Legs in 1859. This was kind of, a lot of people think of Exquisite Corpse as kind of the classic one. So this was a precursor to that, where a player takes a piece of oblong paper, having divided it into 3 equal parts. By folding, he sketches a comic head, then doubles the paper over, hands it to another who draws a body, fold the paper over again, passes it to a third who completes the figure by drawing a pair of legs. So the ultimate goal is just kind of a creative, unexpected drawing. This is also referred to in a bunch of other kind of anthologies as pencil sketches, also comical combinations. So other notable art-making games are Reach's Outlines in 1881. So this is kind of also one you might have played where you just make a squiggle and then someone has to make that squiggle into something interesting. Draw Quest, which is a massively multiplayer kind of creative drawing environment where you get daily prompts. It was a mobile game. And then Art Deck in 2017. And of these, I'd recommend checking out Art Deck by Maths and Markalt. It's like a collaborative drawing game, so it's with card games. So you each players take turns using a deck of cards with sentence fragments on them to build instructions for contributing to a collaborative painting, such as scrawl to form a triangle, half on the page and half off, and then you take turns and kind of create this final artwork. Asset creation games, the first I could find, and there might be earlier ones, but was Magic Penguin, which was for PlayStation in 2002, which is a weird game, pretty interesting if you haven't heard of it. It was dubbed a drawing RPG. So you draw your main character, and then the types of colors you use, the thickness of your brushes, and the placement of the body parts all affect the powers and attributes of your character. So if you put a lot of red, your character's hit points increase, or if you use a lot of blue, your luck goes up in the game. Other notable games, asset creation games, are Pac Pix. It's kind of like a Pac-Man, draw your own Pac-Man type of game. Drawn to Life, which kind of resulted in a series of games like this for Nintendo DS also, and Draw a Stickman by HitSense. And of these, I would check out Magic Penguin, but then there's also Draw a Stickman Epic 2 is worth a look. It's interesting. It's pretty remarkable that the Draw a Stickman started as just kind of a really simple mobile game, but it's kind of almost turned into a franchise. They made 3 of these things, and they also started using the drawing creatively within the game as part of the gameplay. And I think you probably saw making a sheet of ice and connecting circuits and stuff. And then the last of the categories I've got is under the art making games is artist simulation games. There are not a ton of these, but we've got Action Painting Pro. It's a kind of a one-screen platformer. We have 90-second portraits where you're trying to kind of make a living as a portrait artist, in a park, and you're kind of graded on accuracy. And then Passpart 2, which is this 2017 recently came out, where you're kind of it's a 3D environment, and you're creating these 2D paintings and then trying to sell them to buyers who kind of give you feedback, and you can decide to respond to that or not. And I think one that's definitely worth checking out is Action Painting Pro. It's kind of a pretty deceptively simple one-screen platformer where you're just jumping around from platform to platform and trying to maintain these bars for heart, money, and inspiration in order to keep on painting. And it just results in some kind of really lush, colorful paintings as well. So the better you do, the longer you paint, and the more interesting paintings that kind of happen from it. And that's basically all I've got. Hopefully this has helped you kind of get some perspective on just the amount of drawing games out there. Also just to kind of appreciate all the different types of experiences that drawing games can provide. It also hopefully helped organize them in your brain just with all the kind of genres and subgenres. So go play sloppy forgeries.
Okay, we have some time for a few questions. As usual, if you want, you can raise up and come and ask questions.
Good question. Any of these games or any other games that actually developing artistic skills in any way or form, or it's Guitar Hero to actual Guitar Hero playing? Oh.
So you're asking if these are developing any artistic skills?
Yeah, and like what?
I mean, that's an interesting question. I haven't really looked into if they're any educational or meant for that specific topic. I mean, a lot of these, give you practice in some sort of manner. At least the artistic creation ones, definitely.
The reason why I'm asking, because I've been toying with an idea of having a game that teaches kids at least how to draw. And there are a few methodologies, and they're pretty playful to begin with. So it wasn't that hard to wrap it into some form of.
Yeah, no, I think it's a fascinating topic. It's a good idea. I mean, it's funny in Slappy Forgeries, the game out there. It's just a time limit, but like the effective strategy is just to cover the painting as fast as you can and not worry about details, which is actually a pretty good method for when you start painting, just to think about space and colors. So. Yeah. I don't know if my game does it, but I feel like more can be done with that. So I definitely make that game.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Hello. I'm curious about the research methods that you use to track down some of the older games, because I noticed a lot of them are from the 1800s, but drawing is like a really ancient art form, so I'm wondering if there's just a lack of research around that just because people haven't written it down, or...
Yeah. So I probably could have done a better job, but it is hard to track these things down. I'm sure there's earlier works, and I'd love if anyone knows them to tell me. But I just kind of like started down trails and followed them as deep as I could go, just in libraries and online and stuff. But, sure.
Following on from that, I was wondering if you discovered any interesting non-Western examples of drawing games, and if there's like a different approach in those games at all.
That's also a good question that I haven't really probably fully explored. I do feel like there's definitely a focus on video games here, and I feel like it's the kind of like creative rule set games, that genre is just enormous, and I feel like there's probably a lot there in kind of the games that you're talking about, like the Eastern ones.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jonah.
Thank you.
Thanks.